Due to technical difficulties, the original video for this demonstration was not recorded. So I have attempted to reproduce information that Pete has presented, and hopefully it will come out to as good a demonstration as Pete was able to give, because he did an excellent job.
So if you guys remember, back in, I think it was 2019, I did a demonstration on wooden wind chimes. So you may recognize this shape. So after doing the wooden wind chimes, I had a whole bunch of these wooden tubes that were all drilled and sanded, and a fair amount of work to them. And I decided I didn't want to throw them out. I'll figure out something else to use them for. Months and months later, I was on YouTube, of course, everybody's favorite pastime. And I watched a video by a guy who makes Native American flutes out of PVC pipe. And I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. So I watched that, not putting two and two together until a couple weeks later. And I was like, I wonder if I could make one of those flutes out of that wooden chime tube. And sure enough, you can. So I am not a master flute player, but just to give you guys an idea. So there you go. Hey, so I just called for more rain doing that. So Native American flutes. I did a lot more research, and apparently it's a whole big deal. Just like in wood turning, we have the Mike Mahoney's and the Jimmy Clues and all these famous people. In Native American flute making, they have their version of those famous people, and it's a big deal. Some of these flutes, as we were talking, go for a couple $1,000 to probably $10 I might sell this for. So it's a very, very easy project to do. I would almost say that it's probably and you most likely have everything that you need to do one of these already in your woodworking, wood turning toolboxes. So with that being said, what do you need to turn a Native American flute? So you need some dried lumber that has been cut either on the bandsaw or table saw to a square profile dimension. Thickness and width. That just makes it easier. Typical spindle blank kind of stuff. You need a lathe. You need a 4-jaw scroll chuck. You need a live center, preferably with one of those thread-on cones like these. Drill chuck. Various different sizes of drill bits. You'll need a spindle roughing gouge, a parting tool, and some sort of calipers, veneers, whatever you use to size things. Then for woodwork tools, some files, rasp, sandpaper, chisels, things like that. Nothing crazy, pretty much what you already have. A bandsaw and a drill press comes in handy, but not necessary. You can do this with cordless or corded drills. Like I said, pretty simple to do, and you don't need to go buy a ton of stuff to do this. Hopefully you have all of it already. All right, so to start off with, we're going to take our spindle blank. So I've got one of our normal center finders for wood turning. I'm going to locate center on both ends. This is mahogany. I chose mahogany, well, because I had it, but also because it's nice and soft, makes the drilling go easier. If I was making this more seriously, I would probably use, this is a piece of quilted maple, soft maple, that I got from Doll Lumber a couple weeks ago. This would make a much nicer looking Native American flute. I think this was sassafras. That would be nice too. But I had the blanks already for the chime tune, so it worked nicely. All right, once you find center, we want to give ourselves a little dimple. I'm using a spring-loaded center punch. You can use anything pointy, an awl, the point to a drill bit, anything that just gives you that little dimple in the end. All right. Now, if you guys remember my wooden wind chime demonstration, this whole beginning part is identical, the same exact procedures. So 4-jaw chuck, we're going to loosely grab one end in between the jaws so that the corners are between the jaws. That gives you a nice secure hold, not tight yet. And we're going to bring our tailstock up and get that dimple that we made right in there. And the brad point bit is going to act as a dead center and keeps this piece perfectly parallel and centered between the two ends. All right, now we can go back to the chuck and finish tightening that up. It doesn't need to be crazy tight because you're a square peg in a round hole. It's not going to go anywhere. You just want to kind of support that while you're doing the drill. Some tips for doing this long bore drilling. Number one, I prefer a brad point bit, specifically because of the point of the brad point. That serves as not only creating a pilot hole, but also gives the bit a guide to remain straight while you're drilling. If you're just doing an inch or two deep, Forstner bit's fine. But I feel that a Forstner bit is a little bit too flat. The profile of the cutting face is too flat and the chips can't get removed easy enough. So it causes the drill bit to kind of wind off center. The other key technique is to let the drill do the work. You've got sharpened steel against wood, the steel's gonna win. But if you push too hard, the chips will bind up and it'll start to push it off center. So go slow, let the drill do its thing and clear the chips pretty frequently. Okay, so we've got everything all ready to go. Away. And speed wise, we're probably about 300 or so, if I'm reading that right. I'm just looking to make sure that I'm producing good chips. When I see these kind of ribbons, I know that I'm moving at a good pace into the wood. If you're creating more sawdust, you're going too slow. If you're creating big chips, you're going too fast. Size bit is that. This is a 1-inch bit. Now, the bore size of a Native American flute is kind of arbitrary as far as I've been able to find. And guys and ladies, I'm no expert in Native American flutes. I've just kind of figured this out on my own. And a lot of them that I've seen they usually are a 3/4 inch hole, but there has been some bigger ones. And when you're indexing your drill forward, don't slam it in there because that's going to start skewing it off center. once I see that not too many chips are still coming out, then I know I'm probably getting plugged up. If you have a compressor at home, I usually just put the tip of the nozzle right in there, and just that way you can just keep drilling. You start to get that squeal. You can fix that, hopefully. You've got things like beeswax. Now that the bit is hot, apply a little bit of beeswax on there. It can help to lubricate things so that it slides a little bit easier. Since on a Native American flute, we won't be putting any finish on the inside, the beeswax can actually help. So, and you can see by going nice and slow like I'm doing, I'm not getting any wobble on my drill bit.
People, you were doing a flute or a wind chimes back then, used a crayon, kids' crayon, if you could find it.
Oh, yeah, same thing. It's you know, you can if you run out of power, you can light a trail of crayon. We're almost as far as I can go with this. I remember in 7th grade shop class, when we still had shop class, that there was always a bar of soap sitting on the lathe. My dad's tool pouch always had a little stick of soap for lubricating screws and things like that. Okay, so you guys all know I'm a machinist. The number one rule in machining, you don't have to hold on to anything that's spinning or anything that could spin. So I know that even our beloved Ernie Conover touts holding on to this chuck. Do it if you want. I am not a fan of holding on to that. I've gotten too many cuts and scrapes at my shop, and so however you want to do it. Okay, so I've maxed out the depth that I can go with that drill. Now I'm going to switch to another drill with an extension. And basically what we're trying to do is get about 2/3 of the way through so that I'm going to flip this around and drill and meet the 2 holes in the middle. And hopefully I've got enough room. Speed this off a little bit. This extension? No, it's just a straight shaft. It's just, I think it's 3/8 of an inch versus 1/2 inch. True? Good. Still a 1-inch drill. Yeah, I have 2 of them. You know, as many times as I go over this demo in my head, you just can't plan for every possible thing. Yeah, so as we get deeper, that drill bit gets bound up there even tighter. Almost. So is watching somebody drilling a piece of wood as exciting as watching paint dry?
That's because they're waiting for you to come to the side.
What's that?
That's because they're waiting for you to come to the side.
I was doing pretty good. I'm not getting too many wobbles here.
Why do people watch NASCAR racing? For the record.
All right, let's get a measurement, see if we're far enough. I just want to get, somewhat past halfway. Maybe another inch. Pull this out. Flip our piece of wood around. I'm gonna kick that over here. Thank you. Oh yeah. Yep. So no, yeah, I'm sorry. I think I kind of started that thought and didn't finish. So the size of the bore through your flute is kind of arbitrary. It really comes down to how big of a presence you kind of want to have with your flute. Like I said, this came from the wooden wind chime, so I already had these drilled out to 1 inch. So that's just what I've done on all of them. But researching these, I think probably 3/4 of an inch might be a little bit more acceptable or traditional. If you think back to when the Native American population was actually making these, they were using bone and reeds and things like that that were already hollow. So whatever size hole it was. And we'll talk more about this later about actually tuning the flute. You can do whatever size hole you want, and I'll give you a website where you plug that dimension in, whether it's 1/2 inch or 3/4 or 1.5 inches, whatever you want. And it helps you calculate what the spacing of all of the other components that we need to put in here needs to be to make that particular flute in tune. But we'll get to that later. Okay, so we can go ahead and pull this out and flip it around. So same thing, we're gonna chuck it up, we're gonna grab it somewhat snug. Bring our drill bit up and locate that right in the center point that we made. Just like that. And then back to the chuck and we can finish tightening this. Now, it's a lot thinner, so definitely don't crank down on it. You could very well blow this thing apart. And now it's the same thing again. I always find that when doing this drilling, the key is that right in the beginning, just when the flutes touch, to get it running nice and true. Any second now, we're gonna break through.
What's the length of that structure?
I think it's actually, the flutes are 6 inch. Oh, what's the length of the blank? Sorry. It's 18 1/4 inch. This out. Now that we've got our hole completely drilled all the way through, we can actually get some turning done. So we're going to pull this out of the lathe, and we're going to swap out and pinch this between centers. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to put this between centers. And to do that, so you want to have, I'm sure most of you guys have this already, and ladies, is a wooden cone drive center. And what I like to do with any fixtures or anything, even any piece that I turn, it's usually coming in and out of the lathe multiple times. So just a little tip, I'm sure most of you guys know this, but I always like to mark my #1 jaw so that every time I put this back in, I can get it located exactly the same way. And I can feel the teeth of the jaws and get it right back in the same spot. So I don't have to return this cone every single time. So that's tip number 1. We're back at it. So cone centers on each end. And the reason I like to put this between centers is because now that you've got that drill hole through the center, that's become your machine surface. That's running true. So by centering it like this, that ensures me, number one, that my piece is perfectly straight parallel to the bed wave and on center. But when I turn the OD round, I'm going to be ensuring that I have my OD runs perfectly true to the ID. So nice uniform wall thickness. It's not super critical with the Native American style flutes because there isn't really vibrations happening through here like the wooden wind chimes. But it's good practice as well. So, and it's just the way I do it, so. Okay, so we've got that secured between centers, enough tension to hold it. Get our tool rest set up, and I just personally like to set up my tool rest on the tailstock end, just because I'm not great turning with my left hand, so I like to be down here, plus there's more room to work. Spindle roughing gouge to start with. Safety specs. And when setting up my tool rest height, I want to set it up so that my bevel of my spindle roughing gouge is almost vertical, maybe slightly skewed forward. So that's going to put the handle very low against my hip, much more controllable. Speed, we can be nice and high. It's a spindle, small diameter. The faster you get the piece of wood spinning, the better your cut is going to be, even with somewhat dull tools. Standard spindle turning practices, when you're rough turning a squared off piece of wood, you never want to come from out in the open air into those corners. You always want to work from somewhere in the wood and work your way out. Coming straight into these corners is almost a sure way to get a catch, and especially on something like this, if you lop off a whole chunk from one or more corners, it could ruin the whole piece, and then you got to start over. And we're not about making firewood, right? Okay, so we'll start in a couple inches in and working our way till the end. And each cut, I'm going a little bit further, a little bit further. And I'm just trying to go till I make this round, and then we'll start sizing it. You can kind of hear that fluttering as opposed to that nice and smooth. So you know when you're round. So I can feel right here, I've still got some bumps in it. Now that I'm round, I can go back and forth. There's no corners to catch on anymore, so I'm good to go. Okay, once we've got that completed and we're round, we can grab our party tool and our size calipers. So if you remember when we first started, I want to have somewhere around 1/8 of an inch wall thickness. Since I drilled a 1-inch hole, I've got 1/8 of an inch on this side and 1/8 of an inch on this side, so that gives me 1.25 inches. So I'm going to set my calipers to 1.25 inches, just like that. And again, standard spindle turning practices. I'm going to be choked up pretty high on my parting tool, coming in, and the other hand has my calipers, and I'm basically just working the two towards each other. Once my calipers slide over the piece of wood, then I know I'm at size. So we'll come in maybe a 1/2 inch or so in here from the end. I'm just going to get myself a little band, just so that I can get the calipers in there. Don't do that. Just so I can get the calipers in there and they're not going to spew off. Nothing is worse than when you can see you're on size here, but you have them twisted, so you're not in your groove on the backside. So you want to hold them nice and straight. Gentle pressure on the caliper, just so you feel it just go over that size. So that's your first sizing ring. I'm going to give myself another one. Another one. Just like that. Now back to spindle roughing gouge. Now all we have to do is take the remainder of the wood and blend it in with our sizing rings. So now you have the choice. Now that this is all rough turn, we can move everything down to the headstock end, or what we can do is we can just flip the piece of wood around. Since your holes are all running true, you did a good job drilling. That should be the best way to do this. Okay? And then it's the same procedure. Working from the wood out to rough it down. I can hear we're round now. Don't talk while you got chips flying. Same as before. Calipers and parting tool. And then just turn away everything that's left. You'll also notice that I'm not getting a lot of chatter here in the middle. And I think that's because I've chosen a good diameter with that 1/8" wall thickness. It's still stable enough. I'm not getting much flex to it. Now we'll do a little bit of sanding. We're not going to get real crazy. So what I like to do is, you notice I'm roughing this out pretty quick, like literally rough. And that's because I know that I'm going to go with a pretty coarse sandpaper. I like to actually use a sanding block and almost iron this out to blend everything in and get everything nice and round and true end to end. So I find that spending extra time on the spindle turning, trying to get the best finish, is really kind of unnecessary. You have such a great turning tool right here, especially on this soft wood. All I'm doing is I'm seeing all the kind of shiny spots from my turning, like right here and right here and here. And I'm just blending it in so those don't show up. And then we can move on to some finer grits. Woodworking, wood turning tip number 2. You guys don't know how to fold your sandpaper. You want to fold it so that none of the grit is touching. And then you have multiple different surfaces, 4 different surfaces that you can use on this sandpaper. I actually learned that tip here years and years ago at one of the tips and tricks. And all my years of woodworking with my dad, never knew that. So all we're doing here, the purpose of sandpaper is just to remove the scratches from the previous sandpaper. And again, the reason I like mahogany for this is, I mean, it just sands so easy, it's so soft. So think of this like turning a big pencil, you know, in the sanding process, you always want to go with the grain. Same idea here. And then we'll finish off with some 400. And then some Scotch Brite. And the Scotch Brite really polishes out those last little bits of scratches, but more so burnishes the wood. You can actually start to see it, start to kind of almost get a sheen to it. And there we go. Not perfect, but I think you guys know how to sand. So, okay, now that that portion is done, we need to start doing some layout on here for our various different holes and things like that. So I'm going to get my tool rest set up about on center. Pretty much right up against the piece of wood. And pencil. And we're just creating just a faint layout line on there, all the way the whole end of the piece, or the whole length of the piece, sorry. Okay. So I don't know if you guys can see that in the camera. And now we have some dimensions we need to put in there. So for this particular Native American flute, I figured out all the dimensions ahead of time. Depending on the size of the hole that you bore through this, the diameter of the piece, the length, all of that stuff changes the note of the flute. So again, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but every flute is going to be slightly different. This is just for this particular size. So I actually have a handout for you guys that I've left all the dimensions blank. Joe, can you put that up on? Oh, you have it up on. So this is your handout right here. All the pertinent dimensions for making this particular style of Native American flute, which again is a wood turn version of the PVC plastic pipe flute. If you're interested in this, definitely go on YouTube, search for everybody's websites that are pro builders of these. There's a lot of different ways to make these flutes. Some involve the lathe, some don't involve the lathe. Whatever works for you. So I have a couple copies of these, 50 or so, I think. So I don't know if I have enough for everybody, but if you want one, they're up here. And then you can fill in the dimensions yourself. And these will also be available on the group website at some point. Okay, so I've started out, my flute length is 18 1/4. You typically will want to have your flute length a little bit longer than what you need. Because when you tune this, you will hopefully be shortening it to get that exact note. And again, I'll show you guys how to do that. So what we're interested in right now is the working end, which is the mouthpiece end right here. We're going to be doing these dimensions here. So for this size flute, our first measurement is 2 1/4. Sorry, 1 7/8 from the end. And then 3 1/2. Okay. And then off of that center line, you want to go 3/8. 3/8. Same thing on the bottom. 3/8. So that will be 3/4 of an inch wide at each end, this flat that we're creating. Connect all those points, square all that off. Can you guys see that on the, can you see this square that I created here? Rectangle? Okay. So this is, we're going to be creating a flat here. This is going to be the first portion of our sound box, where the actual note is created. So using a 4-in-1 rasp, this is a flat on one side, curve on the other, one rough and one fine of each. We're going to be doing the rough flat side. And we're literally just filing away at that wood to flatten it out. And kind of meeting all of those lines. And then we can switch to the fine side. You want this surface to be pretty smooth, because the mating piece on here, you're trying to make an airtight seal, or as airtight as you can get. Now, once we've got that flattened out and we're happy with the surface, I need to reestablish that center line in that flat that I created. Okay. Now, more dimensional stuff. So our first sound hole is going to be 2 1/4 from the end, intersecting that center line, and then 3" from there. And then just like before, now we need to establish the width. And this width should be approximately half of the width of the flat that you create. And both of these are the same. Any questions so far? None at all? You guys are experts, huh? Okay, so I hope if you can see that. Yeah. Which way? There we go. So we've created our flat for our sound box, and then these 2 lines represent our 2 sound holes, our outgoing and our incoming sound holes. Okay? Now, over to the drill press. We're going to make a series of holes in these sound hole lines, 3/16 inch drill. Okay. So I made a nice V block. Just helps to hold these a little bit steadier. So I've created a kind of oval shaped hole right now. We'll do the same thing to the secondary sound hole. Pardon me? Oh, did I ever drill the holes before this? No, I haven't. I know in the other method of making these flutes, where you're starting with 2 flat boards and you're routing out the hole that we drilled, they will typically drill all of these holes ahead of time. And then you glue up your 2 boards and then you have a square like what we started with, but all the holes are already done. Like I said, that's just another way of making one of these. All right, back in the lathe. And now our lathe is really just a really expensive clamp to hold all of this stuff. Detail file set, little pencil files from Home Depot. These ones I think are like 10 bucks. So we want a coarse flat file. And now we just want to straighten up these edges to make a true rectangle. And like I said, it's thin. It's not going to take much. You could even use a sharp chisel or probably even a pocket knife to do this. Whatever works. Just making sure all the little burrs and everything are off. And then the last thing we need to do is the trailing edge of your secondary hole. So this is your first hole, leading edge, trailing edge. Second hole, leading edge, trailing edge. The trailing edge of your second hole you need to sharpen. So we're going to go inside, kind of at a 45-degree angle. And we're just going to sharpen this edge. Not razor sharp, you just want to thin it out. And it gives the air that you're blowing into here an easier path inside the tube. Just like that. Okay? And that is the first portion of the sound box. Okay. All right. Next component that we need to make is the mating piece to this. So this component right here that is actually fastened by some sort of lashing material to the flute body. Now, I didn't come up with the names for these things. We're all adults here. This piece is called the Fetish. And the Fetish mates with the flute. All right, so the Fetish is also sometimes called the block or the bird. And the Fetish is the key component that channels the air from your breath out the first sound hole, across and into and over the second sound hole that we just sharpened. If we look over at my drawing over there, my rudimentary drawing, the Fetish, as you see, covers over the first sound hole where our breath comes up. And I've created this dotted line to represent a channel that gets carved underneath the Fetish. Our breath goes through here and then blows across the top of the secondary hole. You remember as kids blowing over the top of a Coke bottle? Same kind of principle here. In a musical instrument, though, you remember we sharpened that edge. So we're more like this. And that sharpened edge of wood right there, what it does is it takes our breath, the air from our breath, and separates it. So some of it goes down the inside of the flute and some of it goes across the top of the flute. That right there is where the noise is created, where that sound of the flute comes from. And that will vary depending on the amount of pressure that you blow into the flute. Light, heavy, more air will go through as opposed to over and vice versa. So the underside of the Fetish, I've kind of enlarged it here, has a channel that's been carved out that should be equal to the width of the sound holes that we create. So in our case, 3/8 of an inch wide. Then you have remaining wood here that has been flattened already that will seal or create that airtight seal against the flat of the air box on our flute body. Probably doesn't have to be totally airtight, but pretty good fit. And there's no glue holding this together. That's why you'll see all Native American flutes are used some sort of leather cord or string or rubber band or something to hold that Fetish in place. And the reason is, because I'm sure over time, you guys are all going to make one of these and get really good at it. And when you do, we'll all get together and we'll form the Northcoast Woodturners flute ensemble, and we'll start booking gigs at Blossom and stuff like that. So the more you use these, as with any musical wind instrument, your breath has so much moisture in it. So this would need to be removed and cleaned, replaced, all those sorts of things. Wood and moisture don't really work all that well. So that's why modern ones are still fastened in this fashion. All right? Okay, so to make the Fetish, we've got various different pieces of wood. I had a whole bunch of these multicolored veneered pen and pencil blanks, and they're nice and hard, so they work really well. The dimensions, and again, these are on the chart or the schematic that I created. The dimensions of your Fetish is about a 1/16 or an 1/8 inch ahead of the first sound hole and just flush with the leading edge of your second sound hole. Here's my finished one. So when it's assembled, you won't see the first sound hole, but you will clearly see the secondary sound hole. And that'll have to be periodically adjusted. Tuning the piece, you may have to slightly move forward, blocking the second sound hole, or maybe possibly even back. Okay? All right. So I've made a simple little jig that hopefully will clamps onto my label home. It's just securing that little piece. And then a nice sharp chisel. Now I've laid out, you probably are not going to be able to see these lines. And we want to start by slicing the fibers right along our pencil line, the dimensions that we've created, so that we don't get a big blowout. Slowly remove everything in between. The channel in the bottom of your Fetish really only needs to be about a 1/16 of an inch deep. But you do want it to be relatively smooth, so a nice sharp chisel is important. There are different ways to go about this. Some people will make a spacer plate, basically creating that squared off U shape and gluing that to the bottom of just a basic flat piece. That's Totally acceptable. I also like to curve this leading edge a little bit. It helps to guide your breath through this channel rather than a nice square corner. But I tried making the Fetish out of something else, and it just kept blowing apart, just too weak. These pen blank things are nice and hard. So as far as I know, it does not. I think that, like I said, about a 1/16 of an inch, I felt was more than adequate to get the sound that I was looking for. Okay. So that is the Fetish, and here's the one that you guys can even see this. Here we go. Okay. So I've gone through it, kind of shaped it a little bit more. The one that's going around is, I mean, obviously very thick and cumbersome. So the Fetish is the area of making the Native American flute where you can really let your artistic side kind of come out. So if you look up Native American flutes online, there's a reason that it's sometimes also called the bird. Typically, that component of the flute will be highly carved, three-dimensional, mostly animal shapes, bears and frogs and things like that. But as woodturners, we have a whole nother ability. Turning these things would be great. The two key points are the dimensions of the underside for that channel. And then secondly, you need to have some sort of method of securing the Fetish to the flute body, the string, the leather cord, whatever you want to use. So you'll notice that on this one that I have and on my sample piece there's kind of like this belly carved in there, which gives an area for the cord to hold in place. So I would imagine if you were to turn one, a hole going through whatever your turned piece would be perfect. Hopefully I'll see some of those examples in January, I think. So, all right, so that's the Fetish. Now we've got one more component to make, and then all the real woodworking is done. Got my area here. And the last piece that we're going to make is what's called the plug, and it's literally just a plug. Nothing really special about it. What the plug does, if you can bring my drawing back up, the plug is what actually blocks your breath and forces it up the first sound hole through the Fetish and over and across the second sound hole. So very simple. It's just we have a 1-inch hole, so it's a 1-inch plug. Really, the only two critical things about that are the diameter of it. You want it to be a pretty snug fit inside your flute body. So somewhere around that 1-inch diameter. And the length of it. The length needs to be, the length needs to be exactly from the trailing edge of the first hole to the leading edge of the first hole. You don't want to block your sound holes in any way. So those are the two critical dimensions. Wood doesn't really matter. You can use whatever you'd like. This is just a piece of maple I have. Same practices as before. We're going to reset our calipers for 1 inch. Now, before I go any further, make sure that we're, okay, good. A little bit of material left. That's what I'm hoping for. Now you can get out your spindle roughing gouge and spindle turning stuff, but this piece is so short, I just do it with the parting tool. You want this to be a snug fit, but you don't want it to be so tight that you're going to split the wood. Okay, so now we're ready for just some light sanding. We'll get that right to size. And then we'll part it off. Okay, so now we have the unique ability. We are all wood turners. So this is a round piece. And I don't know about you guys, but when I turn something, I want people to know that I turned it. Like the bottoms of my bowls, I always like to do a little decorative, oh, I lost a magnet. I like to do a little decorative ring or something like that, just so people know that I turned it and it wasn't just sanded flat. So even though this is down inside the flute, I'll see it. And why not do a little decorating? So I have an old scraper, one of my first turning tools. I think this was a Craftsman piece of junk. I resharpened into a 90-degree spear point. Now we can get a measurement. So again, just the space between the two note holes, or the two sound holes. So we are 9/16. Before I take that off, I want to chamfer that trailing edge. And there's your plug. And you can do whatever you want, maybe put your initials on there. So we'll slide that in just so it lines up with our spacing there. And that is that portion of the air box. And now, no, again, because of all the breath and moisture that's going in there, you may have to pull that out at some point. It could shrink and not seal anymore. It may need to be replaced. That lined up, our fetish in place. So that is the absolute basics of a Native American style flute turned on the lathe. Now that, well, let me back up. At this point, you have to do your first tuning, which tunes the main flute, gives the flute its voice, they say. Okay, so that needs to be a specific note. Traditionally, Native American flutes are in the key of F sharp. Okay, so I don't know about you guys, but I don't really have an ear for tuning stuff. So thank you to modern technology. You can download free apps on your phone or your tablet. I just bought my tablet because it was a little bit bigger. That you can tune just about any musical instrument. Okay, so this particular, this is called C Tuner. Again, it was just a free download. There's 100 different ones. You just want to make sure that whatever tuner you get, you can choose different notes. And most of the tuners are pretty intuitive. It knows if you're playing a guitar or a flute or violin, and it sets itself. So we're looking for F sharp, and you're literally just going to play your flute directly into your iPad or your iPhone or your kids or your grandkids, and it will show you. When you're in the green, you're pretty well good. So I might be a little bit on the high side, but it's pretty close. To adjust the flute body itself, you're literally going to shorten the length of the flute itself. So I thought we might need the bandsaw, but I think we're close enough. You'll be taking off just 1/8 of an inch at a time. But since this is, I already made this one, I knew 18 1/4 inches was about what I needed. So I think when I first started, I think I was at like 20 inches long. So it was a lot of going around until I got that note just right. All right. So once you have that tuned to the correct note, you can then move on to the next step, which is actually putting in the note holes, the fingering holes. So we're gonna go back to our cone center. And again, the lathe is just a really expensive clamp at this point. And we've got our center line still established. Now my note holes, this is a good time to talk about where I come up with all of these dimensions. So on this website, aside from a massive amount of history on Native American flutes, this fella has created a fillable form on here where you can put in a couple key dimensions of your flute, specifically the bore size and the note that you want it to play. You can make these play all the different notes of the pentatonic scale, and tell the program the wall thickness at the location of where you want your note holes to be, and it will calculate out for you. If you scroll down, it'll calculate out for you the exact location and drill diameter that you need to use to get it pretty darn close. And then you go to the tuner and you tune each note hole. So yeah, right here. So you've got your flute parameters here. If you scroll down a little bit further, this chart right here is what gives us our various different notes. This is a traditional 6-hole Native American flute. There's 5-hole, there's 8-hole, there's double flutes. It's a huge world out there. But by changing this, we know we're an 1/8 of an inch wall thickness. Change these dimensions to 0.125, 1/8 of an inch, and it will give you the calculated distance from the end of the flute to each hole, as well as the diameter drill that those holes need to be. And again, that'll get you pretty darn close. And then from there, it's one by one, going through and tuning one note at a time. And that tuning involves sitting in there with those files, and very tedious. That portion will take you as long as all of this did. But, you know, if you want to book a gig at Blossom like we talked about, you gotta get this sucker in tune, right? So for me, I've gone ahead and figured this all out already. So I've got my 1-inch bore thickness. I've got, where's my, and I've got my hole location dimensions from the end of the flute. And again, the flute is already tuned, so I'm at my finished length. You can't do these holes until you tune the flute, the bass flute itself. So, for example, my 6th hole is going to be 10 3/4 from the end. Next hole, 9 3/4, 8 3/4, 7 3/4. They're all kind of even for this particular size. But if you change your bore dimension to say 3/4, all of these are going to be completely different, or bigger, completely different. It's all based on bore size and wall thickness. Now the difficult part is the hole diameter. All 6 note holes are not going to be the same. For example, my 6th hole, so the furthest one up, is supposed to be 0.30 inches. There is no 0.30 inch drill. So you got to drill something close and then shape it to size with your files or a reamer, something of that nature. Now I will tell you that my first one here, I think I went with 3/8 holes on all of them just to see how it would sound. Actually, there's one that's a little bit out of tune. I can actually hear it, but for the most part, it's actually pretty good. So I would recommend starting with all 1/4 inch holes, which is what we're going to do, and then kind of go from there. We're obviously not going to be able to do all the tuning today, so you guys will get the picture. So let's lay these out. We're 10 3/4. And then 9 3/4, 7 and a little less than 3/4, 6.4, So there's my 6 holes. And then over to the drill press. So 1/4 inch, and you know I love brad point drill bits, so perpendicular to the drill. Now at this point, accuracy really counts. So for this one, I went ahead and got some leather cord. It is good to have a secure fetish. Placement just right. So you can see, I'm sure you guys can hear it. It's got a little bit of work to do there. So, like I said, a 2-hour project, and they're perfect for stocking stuffers. So I hope you guys appreciate. It's kind of a weird demo. Yeah, finish and all that good stuff. Decorate it, wood burn it, carve it, whatever you want to do. So keep in mind, traditionally, like I said, these were made out of, reeds and things like that. Or, over in Japan, in China, they were made out of bamboo. They really didn't do much finishing as far as I could see. And some of these would be made out of bone and things like that, obviously much shorter. But they just hollow.